Okay, everybody. So welcome to this month's installment of Understanding Film at the Penn Public Library. Today, what we're going to be talking about this evening, our second Ang Lee film. Earlier in the series, we did talk about Life of Pi, but we're going to be talking about a very different Ang Lee film. This time, it's going to be Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon. So let me bring up the presentation here and let's talk about this really fantastic film. Uh, Maybe you've seen this. This came out in 2000, and I'll make sure it's on the right image. Sorry, folks. Not sure why I did that. Okay. Oscar nominated. And so this was kind of a breakout film for East Asian films, Taiwan based films, and also for the mainstream wuxia films. And I'll talk about what a wuxia film is in a little bit. It is also just a really remarkable drama. And having just rewatched it, it's amazing how fresh and vital it still is. We won't be listening to the music because maybe there's a copyright issue, and also I don't know how well it would translate over Zoom. But the score by Yo-Yo Ma, as I'll mention, is fantastic. So hopefully, folks have seen this recently, and if you haven't, again, it's streaming for free right now on IMDb. But it really is a wonderful film. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the genre of wuxia. I'm going to talk about some of the character elements in there, some of the setting elements, and an interesting theme that I was thinking about on my, I don't know, fourth or fifth viewing of this movie. So Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon is a film directed by Ang Lee. And again, cello solos by Yo-Yo Ma is a feature. So again, Ang Lee has gone on to do things like Hulk, like, of course, Life of Pi, but really Brokeback Mountain. But really the film that kind of put him on the map around the year 2000 was Crouching Tiger. It features a couple main characters. We have a main character here played by Chow Yun-fat, who's kind of this legendary swordsman, a mercenary, vigilante, just sort of folk hero. And then Michelle Yeoh is someone who he's been working with over many years. She runs a security firm. She's a small business owner, of course, but she kind of runs this organization of other fighters. She has great martial arts talent herself, and they've had a long-standing relationship. And the film kind of starts up where they're older. Chow Yun-fat's character is giving up his mission in life to be part of this particular martial arts school. He's going to give away his fantastic sword, the green something. I can't remember the name of the sword. And maybe possibly they're going to requite their love, right? We get this implication that for years in the past they've had this kind of relationship, but here they are. The film starts where he's kind of hanging up his cape, so to speak, and she's going to, continue her work, but maybe hopefully find some way to finally be with this character. They deliver the sword to an encampment that's nearby the local governor's house. And in that house is this young woman played by Ziyi Zhang. She's a fantastic young actress in this film. This was her breakout role for the West. She'd been in some things in East Asian films, but this really put her on the map. And after this, Chow Yun-fat and Michelle Yeoh had been in films prior to Crouching Tiger. And then Chow Yun-fat continues to do films. He's drifted away a little bit from the mainstream. Michelle Yeoh continues to do incredible work. Star Trek Discovery she's in. Ziyi Zhang also kind of really launched her career. But anyway, so Ziyi Zhang's character at first seems as though she's a young waif who's going to get married, and she's very demure, it seems, but she has secrets, and she gets tied up with these two characters. When you look at sort of the art behind Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, right? This is a close-up on the poster. One might think, okay, so I'm aware it's Chinese instead of Japanese, but this all just seems like, a samurai film. But what's interesting is that the samurai film out of Japan, of course, has a very particular code and genre. Akira Kurosawa really innovating on that and mastering that in the 60s, 50s, 40s. Wuxia is a little bit different. Wuxia is definitely a little bit different for China. And has elements that the samurai film doesn't have. And for various reasons, the samurai film, partly because it in some ways aligns more clearly with the Western, the American genre. The wuxia film hasn't really been as much of a mainstay in American society. So for one thing, right, martial military armed for Wu, and Jia often is translated chivalrous, vigilante, or hero. And so, we have sort of martial heroes, military heroes, armed heroes, vigilantes, right? Chivalrous, vigilante, hero. Those three in particular labels really apply to Chow Yun-fat's character. But what's interesting about wuxia films is it does lean towards fantasy. So most samurai films don't out of Japan. Wuxia films do lean towards fantasy. Wuxia films often are set in this particular time period. It's going to be a more traditional time period. It could be quite a range, different hundreds of years, and Chinese history obviously is quite vast. But it's rare to see a wuxia film set in the present, where sometimes you might see an updated Japanese samurai film, so the trappings of samurai in the present day. Here, wuxia rarely is there. Also, martial arts, different schools of martial arts in China, and there are quite a few, are often going to be as important as sword play. And so that's a big part of that. But again, of course, sword play is a big part of this. One other aspect of wuxia that's quite traditional is romance. Again, not necessarily something that you would find in samurai films. But oftentimes you do have romantic narratives, either ones that are sort of unrequited lovers, or maybe a romance that goes bad and leads to drama. But the romantic element is definitely part of wuxia films. You see this for sure in Crouching Tiger, both the one that I mentioned with the two older characters, and there's an extensive flashback in the film where we see Zi Zhang, her character, have a romance as well. So we have these two romances. Another really kind of brain-tingling wuxia film that I've always fascinated with is Ashes of Time by Wong Kar-wai. He's a major filmmaker out of Hong Kong instead of Taiwan, like Chow Yun-fat. There's a big retrospective of Wong Kar-wai films coming out. His Ashes of Time is also sort of a play on wuxia, very mysterious, very hard to follow at times, but is about sort of the way that memory and romance is tied up, and it has the other elements we're talking about. And of course, because it's fantasy, you have elements like this. We'll see this GIF one more time later, where folks are sort of flying, sort of hovering. This is kind of the visual style of some wuxia. Not all wuxia have this kind of floating aesthetic, but Ang Lee really leans into this and is playful with it, as well, as I'll talk about. And so again, you would definitely not see this in a samurai film. That's it's very grounded, literally and metaphorically, pun intended, perhaps. All right, anyways, so Crouching Tiger really also leans into the time period. This is a film that was well financed, so we're able to have these wide shots that really establish the culture and the architecture of the world around our characters. From these really wide shots of the city where most of the action takes place, to this temple. This is where Chow Yun-fat's character trains, and it's sort of sprinkled throughout the film. It's the final location of the film as well. To sort of also, instead of these wide shots where it's hard to see folks, we also, Ang Lee gives us a good sense of the culture of the time. This market scene, but on the left we see a theater performance, and we see all the different wares and things and different performers doing stuff. We also see, obviously the opulence. Much of the film takes place only in a couple different locations. The governor's mansion, where a lot of action takes place, Michelle Yeoh's hideout, and then also sometimes, though, we get to see these back areas. So the different differences in class and differences in wealth and sort of status. It's not always going to be sort of the flashiness. We also see some characters are sort of embedded in this, so it's rooted in the plot. And I just this detail here, right? Ang Lee really kind of leans in down to literally the ground level, where we see these wagon ruts that are, I don't know the history. I don't know how these are made, if this is just from constant use of carts or if these are like carved in. I could see it being either way, as a way to sort of control traffic, but I just thought that's an interesting moment. We see the cart going through these ruts carved into the stone. And again, sometimes it's for historical verisimilitude, and sometimes just sort of that vibrant pop of the culture. Here's a shot of Michelle Yeoh early in the film as she's going through the market. Once in a while, as the film goes on, we also get to see some of the hinterlands. This is mostly sort of a film set in urban spaces. That's just sort of the lean of the film. But we do get interesting moments here, like at a tea house later on in the film. So we get some interesting touches like that. one of the most dynamic elements of the film, beyond sort of the lavish setting, the opulent setting Ang Lee does so well, is the transformation of Ziyi Zhang's character. It's sort of the tragic arc of Chow Yun-fat and Michelle Yeoh's character that they don't get to change that much, and I'll talk about that a little bit more later, why that could be. But Ziyi Zhang's character again starts off as this young woman who seems quite innocent and seems quite fragile in some ways, who sort of takes a shine, it seems, to Michelle Yeoh's character, and she's sort of brought in by Michelle Yeoh's sort of legendary status as this mercenary type figure. It must be exciting to be a fighter, to be totally free, and of course the juxtaposition of people think you're free from the stories that have been told about you, but actually Michelle Yeoh's in a tough spot, and we see Ziyi Zhang also is not what she seems. In fact, she's actually this astonishing fighter. And so Ang Lee at first kind of plays around with our expectation in the film. We think maybe it's going to be a Chow Yun-fat super action thriller, and it's not. And Chow Yun-fat before this had done 20 years of super intense, fast-paced action films. So already there's kind of a playfulness in casting Chow Yun-fat in a more demure role. The action star of this film is Ziyi Zhang. So this character turns out to be this amazing fighter, astonishing abilities, and I'll talk about why that's also an interesting literary element. But we see she's sort of these two things, and that really grounds the core of the film. We also have some interesting characters throughout, sort of side characters, from sort of a guard that often works with Michelle Yeoh to this police officer is avenging, I think his wife was killed, and his daughter, who's also a knife-wielding fighter, and the Jade Fox. And so this is an early fight scene where the police officer is trying to get revenge on the Jade Fox, and she's throughout the film, so spoiler, I suppose, on the scene. But what I think is interesting is Ang Lee is peppering the film with kind of these moments that you'd find maybe in a pulp novel or pulp graphic novel. It's action, it's lively. We kind of build up these not campy characters, but kind of lurid, intense characters, and then the scene resolves, and we get back to the Chow Yun-fat, Michelle Yeoh, Ziyi Zhang storyline. It's an interesting way to do things, for sure. Before I talk a little bit more about Ziyi Zhang's arc, though, sort of to develop also, this technique, right? You can't really talk about Crouching Tiger without thinking about the floating and the flying. And what I think is really neat is there is this moment before we see anything, before we see this effect. And again, remember this, to many folks, Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon was the first wuxia film to really break mainstream. And so maybe you even see the trailers and you don't see the floating bits. You just see, looks beautiful, Yo-Yo Ma's soundtrack. And then you come in, you're like, why are people flying? What's going on here, right? So it was a little bit jarring. I remember being jarred as a younger person, saying, like, what is this? What I love is that there's this moment before we see it where we see folks lighting these lanterns and they lift off the ground. And especially the one in the background, you can't really see the wire. And this is historically accurate. You have these wires and you lift up your little paper lantern. It's almost sort of an echo or a preview of the effect that we're about to have. Very in tune with the film, though, which is very embedded. It's not a meta film. It's not sort of commenting that much, but it's sort of hinting and winking at the craft. And so here, what we see, if you watch the behind the scenes videos of the film's creation, is from early wuxia film up to now, wire working would have been it. And it takes a pretty simple process to get those wires out. It doesn't take much CGI effect to do that. But wire work is what you would have done. And so you almost have a hint of it, sort of a playful, the raising of these lanterns, sort of as though you can't really see the wires, sort of like the characters. But what kind of really brings vitality to the film is this almost ballet-like use of this idea of sort of, first is sort of almost parkour. They're kind of running along the wall and she's sort of jumping off the wall, and it gets more and more fanciful. And this is not only, I think, a way to bring in the audience, especially, again, this is sort of, Ang Lee knows it's going to be a bit of wider. Miramax produced this, so he knows he's going to get more play. But at the same time, I think it's also sort of the arc of the film. It gets more progressively and obviously wuxia film in the same way of one of these early sequences. Michelle Yeoh is chasing Ziyi Zhang, who's stolen the sword for the first time, doesn't know it's Ziyi Zhang's character. And then we see Chow Yun-fat also sort of continue. Scenes progress and it gets more and more exciting. And of course, again, here we have that floating aesthetic. There's even a moment, though, interestingly enough, early on in this sequence right here, where this is happening, and often in wuxia films we don't have characters. If we have this effect, the floating effect, we don't have characters like talking to each other, like how are we doing this? It's not like a superhero film where characters are cognizant of the special abilities. It's just people do this in the fight scenes. But what's interesting in this sequence in particular, Michelle Yeoh keeps pulling Ziyi Zhang's character down. At one point says, stay on the ground. It's almost like Ang Lee's again being playful with the concepts and the genre of the film, and has a character sort of comment on it, which is a little bit breaking with tradition while also keeping the traditions very much so alive. And we see this again, we have a lot of those sequences in the governor's compound, various fight scenes. There's another moment where Ziyi Zhang's ex-lover shows up and he's like, the rooftops are really full these days. But the film, towards the end, goes into the countryside, and we see this really beautiful sequence where Chow Yun-fat is kind of chasing her and trying to teach her some humility and some lessons, and it's done through trees. And so sort of the way that this style of movement and action that does feel supernatural but also highly natural. Like, just imagine if we could do this, it would look very naturalistic like this. And I think these scenes toward the end really embrace the potential of this effect, where sometimes a little bit weird at the compound, just you're like, are they going to fly, is it just a big jump? Here it feels almost sort of like naturalistic art, these sequences, sometimes balancing, sometimes flying. I would note that the choreographer who did Crouching Tiger also did the choreography for The Matrix in 1999, so the previous year, Yu Wenping. And then he also did the choreography for The Matrix Reloaded. We see a shot here of that, and then I think Matrix Revolution, all three of the films. And we can really see in this sequence in the chateau in Matrix Reloaded, the Wachowski sisters really leaned into, in the second film, the wuxia style, especially in this sequence, but in other sequences as well. And so they kind of melded Western with Eastern mentality in that film. There's a lot of, and you can see, right, the leaping as well as the running on the balustrade here, some of the same elements we saw in some of the sequences. Some wuxia films also sometimes have almost a Western aesthetic. Many wuxia films, especially in the earlier period, were kind of fascinated with the frontier. And so again, Ang Lee folds that into the narrative. There's this extended flashback sequence where this character, Dark Cloud, I want to say is his name, something like that, attacks a caravan. Ziyi Zhang's younger self is in there. But what's great about this sequence, and kind of, again, builds some of the interesting themes of the film, is instead of sort of just, wilting like a flower, like you might see in a John Ford Western in the United States, Ziyi Zhang gets on a horse and chases this guy. It's like, I want my comb back. I want my stuff back. And we get to see that Ziyi Zhang's character, much like Michelle Yeoh's character, much like Jade Fox, this film is actually populated with far more strong, powerful, and complicated female figures. It's not totally breaking with tradition. There are some wuxia films that would have female protagonists. That is a trend more so than in some samurai films, than the arc of samurai films, which is very male dominated. Wuxia had more space for female protagonists, but Crouching Tiger has almost everyone that has that complexity, and those, especially those big show-stopping scenes, are women. Chow Yun-fat has some, but he's, again, as I mentioned, not exactly the focal point of the film. And of course, again, we get not only the romance, but this is a dissolve fade like we saw in Life of Pi for longstanding fans of the series. Anyways, so my final point here, wonderful film. I hope I've explained some concepts of wuxia here. But what I think is really fascinating is that, so by 2000, wuxia has been a mainstream form of filmmaking in Taiwan, Hong Kong, mainland China, different political leans, of course, in those three spaces. For 20 years, 30 years, it's in literature for much longer than that. It's in graphic novels. And what's interesting about this film is that Ang Lee, again, somewhat playful with some of the traditions while being very honorable to them, is thinking about the story even so. And it's not simply that wuxia genre is clearly a fantasy genre, and so we're telling a story that's obviously a story. It's not naturalistic all the time. But we have characters who, in Ziyi Zhang's character especially, is creating her own narrative. So we have the flashback sequence where we see she's really powerful and strong, but she kind of, falls in love with this thief with his gang, and at a certain point, she realizes this isn't going to work because if I just love him, I might be breaking with tradition from my original family, but I'm still relying on him and I'm kind of living his story. And so she gets the sword, she has some altercations with some folks, and then she goes off on her own towards the second half of the film. We have this moment at the tea house where these two guys show up and they're like, they got their weapons, they're looking at her, they think she's a boy because she's sort of dressed in a slightly masculine way, and they're like, "What's your name?" And she says, she brings up an alias, and she says, "I defeated Chow Yun-fat's character." And right in this moment, she's kind of creating this new narrative for herself. And some of this is verbal, some of this is physical. She whips out the sword and demolishes their tools. Um, and I'll get back to that fight scene in a second. Those two, I think, are well, yeah, we'll get back to that. And then following this, there's this astonishing battle in a tea house, and we have this moment where some of the guys that she saw in the original tea house, confronts this whole gang. And first, we see this amazing thing where she's still drinking her cup of tea with one hand, and she's fending off this guy with one other hand because she's this astonishing individual. But she kind of cuts through this tea house sequence, and it's this wonderful bravura moment, Ang Lee kind of using the tea house space, and she's spinning and flying and doing amazing things, and it's technically superb, easily sort of the best, again, balletic sequence of the film. But as she's doing this, she's articulating this legend. She's living the legend. She's sort of physically embodying this new legend, this new identity for herself, but she's also narrating as she's going, saying, I'm this character, I've defeated this person, I'm going to do this. It's this fascinating sequence that, the first time you see it, you're bowled over by the technique and how great Ziyi Zhang is as a physical actress. But upon reflection, this is also a statement moment for her. That again, she's creating this new identity. It is based on violence, though, and as the film goes on, we see the untenableness of that to continuously do acts of violence in the creation of her identity isn't going to work long term, and the film wrestles with that really well. But I'm the invincible sword goddess, she's saying. I'm the desert dragon. Today I fly over Ume and I'll kick over Wudang Mountain, right? The location of Chow Yun-fat's character. So it's really interesting, to me that the film through this character isn't sort of saying she's just, a young woman who can do amazing martial arts stuff. It's really sort of dabbling with how do we create identity, especially in a form of storytelling that is obviously filled with some fantastical elements and is already a genre about stories. And of course, what's important, I've already hinted, I don't want to spoil anything in terms of Ziyi Zhang's character arc, but just to pull it back to the beginning, Chow Yun-fat's character early on, he talks about how, and Michelle Yeoh's here, she's talking about, it's a beautiful sword you have. Why are you going to give it away? And he says it only looks pure because blood washes so easily from its blade. And we can see that these two characters, having lived so much life, Michelle Yeoh's character, remember, having this sort of legend behind her that she finds constricting. Chow Yun-fat's character, aware of sort of his reputation, but also clearly weighed down by his actions, but also the weight of those stories that have been told about him. I think this is probably, sometimes the most overlooked element of the film, and perhaps the most profound, that in this narrative that doesn't follow some of the main elements. We do have these flashbacks we don't really learn much about our main two, it seems, leads. There's a lot of discussion about where did Ziyi Zhang learn her martial arts skills. Chow Yun-fat's always asking, like, who's your master? And she never says. We have these gaps in the story as much as also the understanding of the weight of stories and narrative upon these characters. And I think it leads a real depth and pathos to this film that, while paying great homage to the wuxia genre, really takes some of its elements, some of its stock characters, and makes them something really special. So folks, I hope you found that informative. Next month, we're going to be watching Whale Rider from 2002. So we're moving ahead just 2 years. It is a film set in Australia. It came out in 2002. The young woman here, forgetting her name, I'll have that for next time. At the time, Oscar nominated, was one of the youngest people ever to be nominated for an Academy Award. But it really dwells deeply in Aboriginal culture in Australia, which for the time was especially a larger budget. I think also Miramax produced this one, feature film. And so it's elegant, it's beautiful, it's funny. I remember seeing it many years ago. I haven't revisited it yet, but I've thought about using this in coursework because it has that rich cultural textural element. And so we're going to have some fun with that. It's a beautiful document, and much like Ang Lee's film, it's going to really give a glimpse into a different kind of culture than often is on Western screens.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Mike. That's such a great presentation. You know, you've done so many good explanations of these movies in this series so far. I think that's my favorite so far. That's
Appreciate that.
The best you've done yet. And just this exploration of a style of film that is very different from anything else we've looked at so far, I think is really eye-opening, and especially comparing it to that the samurai film that some Westerners might be a little bit more familiar with and might be tempted to lump the wuxia films in with, you know, they're sort of similar. Having it laid out by you how distinct they are and in what ways, that was really cool. So thank you so much for that. And do any of our fellow viewers here have any questions or comments for Mike?
Can you talk a little bit about the ending when she jumps off the bridge? And you know, it's a very esoteric and, you know, deeply meaningful, but also confusing. How does it fit into the overall, you know, what is Ang Lee getting at here?
Sure. And once again, 21-year-old film. So let's talk about the ending, right? If we haven't seen it, we can also put it in the liner to the Facebook post. You know, if you haven't seen it, wait till the end. But absolutely, Diane, I appreciate you putting this on the table. So, right. So at the end of the film, Chow Yun-fat's character passes. He's able to defeat the Jade Fox, who's been his nemesis. But because violence is sort of inextricably linked with that final sequence, Aziz Zhang's character realizes there's going to come an end point for me, and really, what was the point of all the violence? In terms of doing this to people as opposed to doing something for people. Again, because much of I think it's fascinating this identity articulation she's doing, but at the same time she realizes it's only been for herself. She had to break away from this guy, this thief, but how far are we going to go? So she absolutely, she hears this legend, I believe, from her ex-lover in the flashback sequence that if someone goes to the top of a mountain and they leap off, hoping to wish for someone else's good, someone else's recovery, or someone else's life, that person will be better. And also in the story, the person doesn't die; they just float away. And so I think that's that, you know, it's an obvious direct reference to that. And I think it's also partly it's so live out this narrative. She's, you know, potentially hoping, maybe in a mystical sense, it's going to bring Chow Yun-fat's character back. This might simply be an act of grief and sort of penance. The fact that it's set in that Wudang place, so this is the home of Chow Yun-fat's sort of character or legend. This isn't where he was born, but this is where he learned all the skills, and he keeps going back to Wudang. So she uses that place as a launch point for this act of sacrifice, or maybe not sacrifice, right? I think it's also potentially, so you could see it that way. It could be a very bittersweet kind of ending. I think it's also the fact that how, you know, to the idea of stories, is this story going to be true? You know, she's really been exploring throughout the film the power of stories in her own narrative, and to break cultural codes earlier than that. But can, you know, sometimes we take these leaps of faith, literally, figuratively. And I think it's sort of, you know, the ultimate leap of faith. Am I going to take part in a narrative that seems impossible, but I'm going to do it anyways because I've already done things that need to be addressed? And so that's kind of my read, to kind of put together some themes and put together some other obvious points. Just this time watching it, having now also seen so much Sherlock Holmes, it also kind of reminds me of like jumping off the falls. What is the falls, Alex?
Rickenbacker. There you go.
Reichenbach Falls, yeah.
Reichenbach Falls. I'm sure that's definitely not in any way a reference point. But anyways, that's just something that came to mind when I watched it. I think that's what it is. It's probably also partly like I've kind of put your mind on Lee Sang in that wuxia frame where people float and fly around. But let's take this to the extreme and think, how far are we going to push the fantasy? You've been watching a fantasy. Why do you doubt that this act could achieve something wonderful? And why would that story not be true? As much as Zi Zhang her character probably thinks, it won't happen or is hoping it will. So I think that it is a mysterious sequence. I think there's a lot going on there, and Ang Lee has done a lot to set that up. So it's not simply sort of a trite sacrifice moment.
Yeah, I found it quite effective. When you think about any movie that's an action movie, whether it's, the whatever of these genres you've spoken of, you sort of expect some kind of a powerful climactic moment, some great action, and of course there's lots of action, but this gave it a far more deeply meaningful kind of an ending. I found it quite interesting.
Yeah, I agree. And just as another quick point, I mean, we could dig into the meaning of this scene for a long time, but there's another moment where, probably the low point, I think, when Chow Yun-fat's character is really kind of shaming her. There's one-on-one. He throws the sword past a waterfall into a lake, and she kind of flies right after. It's the same kind of physical arc, and you can see in Chow Yun-fat's face, he's like, wow, she's really going to do everything for this materialistic obsession. And he makes sure that he whisks her off and saves her from drowning. So in many ways, this final act is a redo of that moment for a very different purpose. It's no longer that materialistic and power game. It's about sort of letting go. So
right, yeah, good point.
All right, what do you guys think, Reifs? You have any thoughts?
Dad is confused.
No, not me. I didn't review it for this thing. I've been busy struggling with other projects, but I think Mom, you've looked at it recently, haven't you?
No, I haven't. I'm
You were
going to
going
see
to.
it.
That was it. Yes. Yeah.
And I
But I
didn't.
remember liking it when I saw it. The wire work, the figures in their fantasy world, combining it with reality, I thought was a fascinating mix. And you'd say, well, now how can that be? And yet you realize, okay, the whole thing is how can that be?
Well, that's the style of wuxia, right? That's fantasy.
right.
When you first see it, at least we did a long time ago, I don't think people, at least in the States here, understood that concept at all. That we didn't know that it was to be fantasy, and to have all of these people flying around elegantly, it was just awesome. It was awesome, and then to have the whole storyline under it. It was a beautifully crafted movie, a spellbinding movie, and the characters, I think, were totally fleshed out for being a fantasy movie, as you said. I mean, it had many more dimensions to it than just pure fantasy. So it was elegant, gorgeous thing. Yeah.
It was. But also it's always it's always nice when they have some especially beautiful people in it too. That's always appealing.
Really not really an issue here, but okay.
Well, it is. Well,
yeah.
So
Chow Yun-fat is very beautiful.
I just cannot stop thinking of, here I go with Star Trek, with the Klingons, and
Sure.
how the noble warriors, like you said, there's two parts to the wuxia. It's warrior and also chivalrous, and that's basically the concept of the Klingon culture. They're very noble, and they withstand great horrors, but they have to come to a conclusion. This is what our life is like, and we have to do the best we can as a group of people and as an individual, like Worf had to figure out for himself. So when you see that, it's more to wuxia than samurai, I think. The Klingon culture. So That's just me talking.
I think it's a great connection. It's a great connection. Absolutely.
Yeah, how they come. I don't know who came up with the idea of the Klingons, but I think they found that in the
Yeah.
Chinese
Yeah,
culture.
and they're both apparently fantasy.
Yes.
And what I think is interesting too is that, so the wuxia and samurai films, though in different in some of their trappings, by consistently, almost always consistently placing them in these older time periods, right? What they're really reflecting, I mean, in all these films, I mean, made 1920s up for the technology, but to dwell on this setting are wrestling with these ideas of responsibility that, for the various time periods and codes and ethics and culture that are still with us, even if they're, some of these historical elements are not there. If it's part of the culture, as we're sort of wrestling with them, these, as with all genres, they help us kind of transpose and rethink some of these ideas. And I think, Star Trek, certainly through all the different worlds that are explored there. I mean, Star Wars to some degree, but it's really delving in those families, so it's more of a fantasy. Star Trek really did a great job through Gene Roddenberry's ideas of exploring cultures again, instead of through genre of, samurai or wuxia, but through science fiction. Again, to have a culture that is sort of some of the same codes that are explored in these films. So I think that's the intention of using art, genre, storytelling to explore this is right on.
Yeah, I agree.
Awesome to make those connections. Not what I would have thought of off the top of my head, but that makes total sense.
I love
And there's that classic episode where Kirk goes floating over the Enterprise. No, I'm kidding. That never happened.
I was going to say, I love the idea that she loves the Klingons. I mean, I'd never expected that.
What?
Good for you.
He's a Trekkie from way back.
Oh, especially when there's, I guess it's in Deep Space Nine, and there's one ship that Martok takes over, this great general, because they're having a hard time beating the Dominion, which is the foe. And somehow they actually get, whoa, what's this? Anyway, they get, oh, there it is.
Doesn't it look kind of like a Klingon weapon?
Yeah,
right?
that says, yeah, isn't that amazing?
He even kind of has like a Klingon beard going on.
I know. Well, that's it. But anyway, he goes into battle with them, and they come out victorious. And what do? They start singing. All of them, the women are just as powerful as the men, and they're all singing their glorious victory and the victories of the past brought into this victory now. And it was a spellbinding. That one moment, maybe it lasted 30 seconds in the whole episode, but the same kind of feeling of euphoria that you get from this movie. It was just spellbinding to watch all of these people who were down in the dumps, and then all of a sudden they're victorious, and they keep winning. I don't know if they kept singing, but they were singing at that point. It was wonderful. Anyway,
I really appreciate celebrating the art there, but before we spoil a third film or show, as you talk about the end being victorious. Anyways, thank you so much, everyone, for coming. I really appreciate it. And in a month, we're going to talk about Whale Rider.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that. So on the 26th of March, right, Mike?
That's whatever will be the last Friday, correct? Yeah.
Fantastic. All right, and I saw thank you from Nancy. Thank you, Nancy. Thank you, David. Thank you, Reifs. Thank you, Aunt Diane. Thank you, Anna, if you're there. Good to see you all, and we'll see you again next time. Thank you, Mike, so much.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael, and especially Alex. It's a great idea. This is all a great idea. So
thanks, Dave. See everybody.
Ciao, ciao.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Have a good month, everybody.
All right. You too.
Bye-bye.